Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the professor, and this is the moment of truth.
The president of the San Francisco NAACP and the pastor of the Third Baptist Church, Reverend Amos C. Brown. Dr. Brown, thanks so much for being here. So $5 million to every Black resident. That sounds good to me. That sounds like something, that sounds like a plan that everyone would like who would be a recipient of that. So why don't you like that plan?
Let me correct something. The board has not agreed to my $5 million plan.
Yeah, it's a proposal. I
That's
get it.
something
I know. It's a proposal, but why don't you like the proposal?
Because it has become a laughingstock around this nation, and representatives of it have indicated it was not based on any formula. It was not thought out logically, so that we should not be teasing and tantalizing African Americans. We are in trouble in this city. We need action now. We've had far too many studies, too many analyses, too many suggestions. And if the board were serious about that, this past Tuesday, they would have in principle supported cash payments and suggesting a plan for payment, even though as some say, we have a deficit, we can't do anything now. Well, deficits don't last always. And even in Germany, Germans pay by installment. I'm looking for, and the NACP is looking for, real action and not intentionality. We've talked too much about reparations. In fact, it was the NACP branch that introduced the idea in 2019. So we can't be like Jack and the Bear, making tracks, but getting nowhere. Even this U.S. Congress of this nation has not acted on reparations in principle, and 70% of the nation are against it. Now is the time for all fair-minded, informed, loving, just citizens to join us as African Americans and support us as we supported reparations for the Japanese and for the Jewish community. That's the bottom line issue. We are not against cash payments, but we want sincere action and not optics.
So you don't think this is so sorry to interrupt, but you don't think this is a serious proposal by the Board of Supervisors?
It's not on the board what has happened. The board has not acted. It was a representative of the task force who threw out this number without any basis for it. And people are entitled to their opinions. But on issues like this, you need facts and you need practicality. And that's the only thing the NACP is looking for. Real action and not suggestions.
Thank you. Dr. Brown, I really appreciate you clarifying all of that for us.
Notice how that Camerata woman was smiling and all giddy, especially when she said, "That sounds good to me. That sounds like a plan that everyone would like who's a recipient." By the way, she used to work for Fox, and given her sarcastic, smarmy attitude, it's clear she still does, at least in spirit. For those of you who may have missed it, the clown who was slamming his gums, that was Reverend Amos Brown. You'll recall that we talked about him last week. Well, now at least we know who the original Amos and Andy was. And before we go any farther, I fully expect that a number of commenters are going to call themselves sticking up for Reverend Brown. Yesterday on Twitter, I had a brief infestation of such individuals. It's the same way as whenever we talk about the current presidential administration, we get the usual contingent of Biden bots and especially the Kamala butt kissers who come out of the woodwork. Well, please whine away. Amos Brown is a disgrace to humanity. Dr. King said we're coming to Washington to get our check. But this civil rights retread says black people don't need a check, and please don't try to cop out to say he wants cash reparations. No, he doesn't. We got the receipts. He got lit up last week when he was caught rejecting cash reparations, so don't try it. And even though he claims we've been wanting reparations since 2019, right? Then why is it that he still doesn't have a concrete cash reparations figure in mind yet? Last 4 years, he ain't been thinking about it, apparently. All he says is that, $5 million is an arbitrary figure. That's the problem. It's just that $5 million, that's an arbitrary figure. What are they basing that on? Notice that he does not actually tell you what figure that he would prefer. He doesn't say that. He just says he doesn't like the one that's being put out there. Learn to recognize when someone is lying to you. If he really doesn't oppose cash reparations and his problem is just that he thinks the $5 million figure was picked out of the air, then why doesn't he tell us all what figure he would consider to be more well-reasoned? But he doesn't, though he did make sure last week to send a letter to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors telling them that he and the San Francisco branch of the NAACP reject cash reparations. So all you morons out there repeating his phony lies that he's in favor of cash reparations or in favor of reparations at all, you are the weakest link. Amos Brown, who is also Kamala Harris's pastor, in case you didn't know, is a liar. Nothing he says is true or even valid. Allow me to debunk his talking points again. First, he starts off his little weasel word statement by saying it was his $5 million plan.
The board has not agreed to my $5 million plan.
Well, in that case, why did he write a letter just last week saying that he rejects the task force's proposal for a $5 million reparations payout? Look, some of you have been trying to claim that he had previously given lip service to the idea. Well, I don't look at what people say. I look at what they do. He's claiming that it was his plan, but now he's doing everything he can to tear it down. That don't make sense. The NAACP didn't introduce reparations either. This is like in Cobra trying to claim that they're the oldest reparations group in the country. No. He had nothing to do with what's going on right now. The grassroots brought it about. And even if you want to claim that his name is on some piece of paper with the task force, he's certainly made it clear that he's against it now, hasn't he? The reason that what he's saying keeps convoluting itself and keeps contradicting itself is because he's trying to have it both ways. He wants to say no reparations should be happening at all. We just need to hold hands with the love of Jesus because Biden wants it that way. And these Democrats who got me in their hip pocket, that's what they told me to say. But at the same time, we lit him up last week. But he knows he can't say that. So instead, he's saying that it's his $5 million reparations plan while he says that it's an arbitrary figure pulled out of the air. It's his plan, right? See how this doesn't make any sense? Next, he reaches for the absolute weakest talking point of all, saying that 70% of America is against reparations.
Even this U.S. Congress of this nation has not acted on reparations in principle, and 70% of the nation are against it.
That's not an argument. In fact, it actually proves that cash reparations is the right thing to do. But since the pork chop preacher is so fond of polls, I'll go ahead and give him one that he can chew on. The black media has already covered that support for reparations has actually grown the last few years. That's something that Reverend Brown didn't mention, did he? In June of 2020, the white media reported on a Reuters Ipsos poll that said only 20% of Americans supported reparations. Well, yesterday CNN reported that number now stands at 30% who support reparations. That's a 50% jump in support for reparations in only 3 years. The trend is going in the right direction, the direction of reparations. But you notice that Reverend Porkchop didn't tell you that, and neither did CNN. Nobody was pointing out, gee, the support for reparations has been growing year over year. Support for reparations is expanding by leaps and bounds. The white media's own numbers prove it. This isn't a black organization who put these numbers together. This is Reuters putting this together for you. But they don't want people hearing that. So they bring on this pulpit pimp to only say, well, what about the 70% who oppose it? And it's not even an actual 70% opposed to it. It's actually 68%. So opposition to reparations is under 70% now. Now, if the subject was about any other constituency, like, say, gay marriage or abortion, you think the white media wouldn't be pointing out that, oh, but support for it keeps growing year after year? You think they wouldn't be saying that? So all of you smart, dumb people trying to claim that Reverend Brown's not really against reparations, is this how you support reparations? By not telling people the truth? By getting on CNN and saying that 70% of the public is against it? If he's been studying reparations since 2019, then shouldn't he know that support for reparations has been growing enormously the last 4 years? Why isn't he telling people that? That reparations is more popular now than it's ever been, and that its popularity has been growing enormously the last few years, that the numbers of people opposing reparations has been shrinking. If you truly believe in reparations, then the main thing I would expect a true advocate to do is to talk about whether that support has been growing or not. But he didn't do that. And he didn't do that because he doesn't want reparations to happen. The black grassroots have been the ones pushing that train, not him. And his white handlers like Joe Biden and Ari Emanuel and the others, they've been seeing the direction that the numbers have been trending in, the wrong direction for them. Reparations isn't dying as an issue, and it's only becoming more popular. If the trend continues, then in time, the opposition will be whittled down to 66%. They're only about 4 percentage points away from that. Every time black people are pressing something that's in our interest, be it reparations or punishing the police for committing crimes, we always get some mouth-breathing moron who says, well, the polls say 70% of the country is against it. This is how it's been ever since they started taking polls on black media's issues. In 1963, Gallup conducted a poll asking Americans how they viewed Dr. King's March on Washington, whether they viewed it favorably or unfavorably. 60% of respondents said they viewed it unfavorably. That's 3 out of 5 Americans who said they viewed the March on Washington negatively. 3 years later, Gallup conducted another poll in 1966, 2 years before Dr. King's assassination. They asked people how popular Dr. King was with the American public. 63% of respondents gave Dr. King an unfavorable rating. 63%. The number of people who viewed Dr. King unfavorably had gone up since 1963, not down. And this was how Dr. King was regarded while he was alive. And this hostility to black demands for justice wasn't just limited to Dr. King. Gallup conducted a poll in 1961 asking if people approved or disapproved of the Freedom Riders. 61% of respondents said they disapproved of them. In 1963, Gallup asked if people thought mass demonstrations by black people was helping their cause for racial equality. In 1963, 60% of respondents said demonstrations were hurting our cause for racial equality. The next year, Gallup asked the same question, and the number jumped to 74%. That was a 25% increase from just the year before. And those dates are important because Dr. King held his March on Washington on August 28, 1963. That was 2 months after the first poll Gallup had conducted. At that time, 3 out of 5 Americans said they opposed us demonstrating. But after Dr. King's March on Washington the next year, Gallup found 3 out of 4 opposed it. Simply us demonstrating. 74% against. And it's not as if CNN doesn't know this. All this information about the Gallup polls was published on CNN's own website. And yet when someone like Amos Brown spouts some gibberish about black demands and 70% negative polling, CNN doesn't point out the fact that historically black demands have never polled well. So why does anyone care? It doesn't even matter. It's just par for the course. I want you to think about these numbers whenever some white right-wing racist or left-wing racist or some bootlicking Negro tells you that 70% of the country disapproves of Black Lives Matters or defunding the police or disapproves of reparations. Any and everything we have ever advocated for is hated by at least 65% of the population. It has always been that way. Even an old fossil like Amos Brown should know that one. You're not telling me anything new or disturbing by saying 70% of the country is against it. 70% of the country is always against anything that black people demand. So the question for Amos Brown and CNN is, were all those white racists who opposed Dr. King and the Freedom Riders and who opposed black people demonstrating right? Should Dr. King have decided to listen to the polls? Should the Freedom Riders have listened to the polls? Should Black America have listened to the polls? All of those civil rights activists, and I'm sure Amos Brown will claim that he was marching somewhere. Shouldn't he have listened to the polls? 70% of the country said they didn't like it, so he should have listened, right? Well, it's 60 years later. Were the people who opposed black demands right? Or was the unpopular Dr. King and his other freedom fighters, were they right? When it comes to opposing something that black people are demanding, the absolute weakest retort you can give is 70% of the country doesn't like it. It's been that way since the days of Dr. King at least. All that proves is America hasn't changed since the days of Dr. King. And it also shows that this is something that needs to happen because America always resists the changes that are needed to move it forward. The reason Brown talked about polling was because that's what his white handlers at the DNC told him to say. And if you think that his former congregant, Kamala Harris, didn't tell him to oppose this, then you're an idiot. Remember when Kamala Harris was asked if she supported reparations? What did she say?
So I'm not going to sit here and say I'm going to do something that's only going to benefit black people. No.
For him to even bring up a poll, that's just so out of the ordinary. None of these civil rights fossils ever does that. Whenever they're talking about something, they don't ever say, well, there's like 70% of the country don't even like it. That's how you know he was fed that talking point by white power. And please don't think CNN didn't know that. Before they put any of these clowns on the air for their segments, they always do a quote-unquote pre-interview where they sound them out and find out what they're going to say. So they knew what this guy was going to say before he even went on air. When people start talking about polls, that's a politician's argument. That's an argument that you get from a political party, not from an alleged civil rights organization. On top of that, you notice how the white media never tries to hold other groups' interests hostage to opinion polls? When it came to the Asian hate crime bill, when it comes to money for illegal immigrants, money for the Red Indian, money for the U.S. Holocaust Museum, nobody ever tries to say that the public opposes money for these things, so it shouldn't be done because it's not popular. No president tries to govern according to opinion polls either. Yet when it comes to black people's demands, first thing we get is the go-to talking point, well, it's not popular, you know. And please don't bring up his blink and you'll miss it talking point about Japanese and Jews getting reparations. That's just a distraction, a pathetic CYA maneuver, because he knows that we were going to see what he said and he's trying to cover himself. The issue is not what other people have gotten. The only thing we should be talking about is what we're going to get. And if Amos Brown was honest and not some bootlick, what black people should be hitting San Francisco up for is the only thing he would be saying. He'd be saying hard figures. He'd be saying dollar figures. But notice he never does that. You cannot in one breath say that the $5 million reparations proposal was your idea, and then in the very next breath complain that it's an arbitrary figure as if you had nothing to do with it. And then afterwards complain that you want to see something done, but you never say what. And notice that Amos Brown doesn't mention his letter from last week at all. He went through all the trouble to put out this public letter to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors with some gibberish about public housing, jobs on infrastructure projects, and education assistance. And yet he's on CNN and he doesn't even mention it. Gee, if it was good enough for him to mention it last week so that he could interrupt the very idea of cash reparations, why didn't he mention it on CNN at all? He claims that his $5 million reparations proposal apparently is an arbitrary figure. Well, that was the time for him on CNN to say, well, just last week, we spelled out what a real reparations proposal would be. Gee, I guess he suddenly doesn't want health care, public housing, or the Fillmore Heritage Center anymore, right? And speaking of the Fillmore Heritage Center, you'll recall that Brown did make one specific request in his reparations rejection letter last week. He wrote that the Fillmore Heritage Center should be preserved and protected, as well as the surrounding blocks, which he misspelled as blacks. Well, I noticed something else last week. The address Brown listed for the San Francisco NAACP is on 1290 Fillmore Street. Well, isn't that a coincidence? So that got me curious. I looked on Google Maps to see where the San Francisco NAACP's office is located, and then I checked to see how far it is from the Fillmore Heritage Center. It is literally 1 block away, within spitting distance. You can walk from the San Francisco NAACP's office to the Fillmore Heritage Center in less than 60 seconds. So, no wonder Amos Brown is so hot and bothered for the city to put money into the Fillmore Heritage Center and the surrounding blocks. Well, actually, since he's on Fillmore Street, maybe he did mean the surrounding blacks after all. Now, for all you people who were cheerleading for this man yesterday, and no doubt today, telling us about how this man, he's concerned about black folks, he wants cash reparations, you can see the doggone duplicity a mile away. This is your man, right? Amos Brown is poo-pooing cash reparations, but he does want the city to build up the area where he and his professional do-nothings can personally benefit from it. That's what this is about. Them young black folks, they don't need nothing. Y'all need to make it nicer around here for my office. I mean, we need to enhance the land values around here. For me. He's hoping that the city will make their office a nicer place for them to go have their spring luncheons and their summer breakfasts and their fall fish fries, etc. Amos Brown couldn't be specific about what dollar amount that he thought cash reparations should be. In fact, he couldn't be specific about anything for reparations except for the Fillmore Heritage Center. He was real specific. He told you the exact place that he thought that the city needed to be doing some reparations. He told you exactly where the Fillmore Heritage Center and the surrounding blacks. Yeah, he got specific about that, didn't he? But that's the only thing that he was specific about. Something that would benefit only him. The only thing that matters is how much that check's going to be for. And he totally sidestepped that issue. He says action is needed, but he never says what action. He gives a phony, clearly insincere throwaway line about cash reparations are needed. Then he immediately goes right back to saying a serious proposal's what we need. You know, if the San Francisco NAACP really has been chewing on this problem for at least the last 4 years, then shouldn't Amos Brown have been a little bit more prepared than this? Why is he completely unable to say what he thinks the dollar figure should be then, and what he bases that on? After all, they've been working on this for years and years. They're ready now, aren't they? Or does it sound more like Amos Brown and the San Francisco NAACP never thought this day would come? They never thought that anybody would actually say, okay, we're going to press all of those white Democrats that you keep getting money from and yucking it up with and hanging out with them at the latest luncheon. We're going to hit them up for the money and pressure them. He didn't think this day would ever come because bootlicks always think masses got all of us under control. In fact, the bootlicks count on it. Well, the Democrats didn't send him out here to advocate for reparations. They sent him out to muddy the waters, throw up a smoke screen, throw up some verbal vomit. And that way the people who don't want reparations can hide behind him and say, hey, here's this Negro pastor over here, and he says reparations is a bad idea. And he's not going to say, no, reparations, here's how much we should get. He's not going to do that. Instead, it's going to be, well, y'all messed it up for asking for $5 million. Y'all should have just done like me and said some public housing and some infrastructure jobs. Yeah, that's reparations, because that's what the Japanese got, right? The Japanese got some infrastructure jobs. They got some health care, and they got a Fillmore Heritage Center, right? That's what the Japanese got, right? That's what the Jews got, right? That's what the Native Americans got, right? See, he damaged himself last week and he knows it. So here he is, pathetically trying to get his street cred back. But it's not going to work. We're not fooled. He said exactly what he meant. Too late to clean it up now. But then again, the black clergy has always been doing this. There's something that we, as the descendants of the slaves in America who built this country, need to remember. Practically all of the slave revolts in the United States ended in failure. Why? Because all of them were undone by traitors from within. We didn't separate the wheat from the chaff among us, and there's been no greater turncoat and no better ally to white power than the black preacher man. Now, I'm not saying that every black person who quotes the Bible is on the BS, but the problem is too many of them who have been. We've fallen a long way from the days of Nat Turner and all the way to Dr. King, men who used the Bible as a revolutionary instrument of liberation and empowerment. But remember, there were a lot, and I mean a lot, of black preachers who white power has had on the payroll, especially to fight Dr. King. When we tell his story, we tend to leave that little last bit out. See, the pulpit pimps didn't start after Dr. King died. We usually have a timeline that makes it where the fall of the black church began in 1968 with the assassination of Dr. King, but that's not true. The tradition of black bootlicks using the Bible to keep us in check began on the plantations. You can find engravings showing the master of the plantation and even his wife sitting in the pews, while some crusty, dusty, wrinkled-up bootlick preacher was presiding over the prayer service. This is what was going on the plantations. Pulpit pimps have been a key, crucial part to maintaining white supremacy's control over us. A couple of years back in my first commemoration of the real Dr. King, I told you about Elder Michaud, a so-called black preacher who J. Edgar Hoover was literally having on his mailing list. Elder Michaud worked hand in hand with the FBI, even having his parishioners protest Dr. King and claiming Dr. King didn't really speak for black people. Oh, he was an approved of Negro who white power had no problem giving a platform to. He also used his so-called church as a front to disseminate FBI COINTELPRO talking points under the guise of his anti-king sermons. This was a bought and paid for bootlick who the white establishment gave a platform to, and they had him claiming he spoke for black people, even though he was just a puppet of white power. Gee, sounds just like the NAACP now, don't it? You want to know why church attendance fell off a cliff starting in the late 80s, early 90s? Because Gen Xers stopped going. We saw the BS and we were turned off. And clearly nothing's been done to change this since, because the millennials and now Generation Z are following suit. The black clergy prostituted itself to white power, and at this point they are in full Uncle Tom mode. And it's these decrepit, wrinkled-up losers from a bygone era who we see demanding that nothing be done for black people. The Amos Browns of the world, they're cowards. They didn't fight when they were young, and they've been bootlicking ever since. Now they're just old cowards. He's dependent on white power to invite him to their little get-togethers. He depends on white power for every crumb of his daily bread, and he's been their loyal pet for decades. The problem for us is you got too many black people, including a number of them who you'll see in the comments section, who have got poor critical thinking skills. That's why preacher man punks like Reverend Brown appeal to them. Some of us are just permanently stuck on stupid. Someone told them that land should be reparations because land will never be worth zero. Well, listen up, stupid. Without cash, how are you going to pay the property taxes? Without cash, how are you going to develop the land so that it's not just an empty field of nothing? Without cash, how are you going to even cut the grass on the land? Now, you always got a few desperate fools who try to trot out some apocalyptic scenario. Well, what happens when the dollar is worth nothing? Really, genius? That's your talking point? Tell me something. What do you pay your utility bills with then if you think the dollar is going to be worthless one day? What do you pay it with? Do you pay it with dirt and grass? Or do you pay it with money? U.S. dollars are not going to be worth zero anytime real soon. And you clearly don't believe that the dollar will lose its value anytime soon because you're paying for everything you have in dollars. So knock it off. And judging by some of the comments I've seen the last 24 hours or so, I'm sure some of you are probably members of Reverend Brown's congregation. So you feel the need to stick up for him and run interference for him, but you picked the wrong one. It just goes to show this is one of the three areas that too many black people simply cannot handle: entertainment, politics, or religion. We all understand why a clown like Elder Michaud would be attacking Dr. King, but why was it that he had black parishioners who were in there with him, who are actually sticking up for the very system of oppression that they should have been trying to dismantle? It's because we have some mushy-headed Negroes who are willing to fight against their own best interests. And unfortunately, it's been this way since the days of the plantations. They don't know their best interest, and they can't be taught it because there's simply no way to fix stupid. See, we have too many black people who have never handled business in their entire lives. Too many black people who don't know how money actually works, and yet these are the main ones who post comments saying stupid stuff like, scholarships could be reparations. And they actually think that sounds smart. Poor people with poor thinking skills get ripped off. And they also help our enemies to undermine us with scams that will never improve our condition. We can't afford to listen to the low-information half-wits whose only expertise is in smoking a blunt and watching reruns of some clown on YouTube blathering about status correction, and they think that qualifies them to speak. There's nothing inherently wrong with land as reparations, but without money, you won't be a landowner for very long. That was why General Sherman's orders said 40 acres and a mule. In other words, the idea was that the former slaves would have the means to work the land, to make the land productive so that it could generate income for them. And you better understand that fact. I think we all recall the story about Bruce's Beach, the black family who owned land in California and had it taken right out from under them. And last year, they got that land back. But just 2 months ago, they announced that they're going to sell it. And what are they selling it for? Are they selling it for more land? Are they selling it for scholarships? Are they selling it for health care infrastructure projects? What are they expecting as compensation for the land? $20 million in cash. The family gave a number of reasons for why they chose to sell the land back to the county. The main reason, however, being that they're all in stages of their lives now where they want money to invest, not land. Remember last week when I told the Land is Reparations crowd that there's a lot of black people who already own land, and that with reparations what they would really want is to have money that they can use to develop the land that they already own. Well, in the case of the Bruces, they don't even want land. They just want the money to invest instead. Though in their case, even if they wanted to develop the land, they can't, because the county's already made it where the land is not zoned for development. And the family already decided that they weren't willing to take the years-long legal battles that it would be required to even attempt to get the city to zone it for development. Considering that the family doesn't even live in Southern California anymore, does anyone really think that the racists out there like Gavin Newsom didn't already know that this would be the most likely outcome of giving those people the land back? They've already pulled this with black folks in LA, San Francisco, and elsewhere in the state. These white supremacists have got decades of experience when it comes to displacing black people. They know the ins and outs of how gentrification works. That area out there is expensive as hell. It would be tough enough to fight for your land when you live there, even tougher when you live in a place that requires so much of your income just to stay there. But when you have people who don't live there, and you got everybody else who already has had the land developed and they're realizing some good income off of it while the county's saying you'll get $400,000 maybe, well, it doesn't take much to see that those people are probably going to decide that if they can't actually develop the land, you might as well sell it and try to see what you can get for it. This was what the government wanted to happen out there. And it's no surprise that you had this woman from the LA County's office who was saying that this was a model for reparations that they hoped they would see across the country. When I hear words like that, it reminds me of Christopher Rufo and all of that anti-black nonsense he's doing in Florida, hoping that that becomes a model for the nation too. So you got Republicans and Democrats, when they talk about black people, they use the same language because they're both on the same mission. Land as reparations may sound good in a contextless vacuum, but we don't live in a vacuum. We live in a real world where land has no real value unless it's being used and developed, and to do that requires money. Holding on to land requires money. You can claim that land should be part of an overall reparations package, with cash reparations being the foundation of it. But that's not what Reverend Porkchop was saying. He was saying cash reparations was a laughingstock, and he didn't say anything about land. For the slow wits in the room, I know some of you latched onto some dim-witted talking points that you heard years ago from some slick-talking professional BS artist, like the kind you see on certain YouTube channels or Facebook live streams. But in the real world, if you don't have the money to pay property taxes, land as reparations will merely allow you to simply sell it to some white land developer who will have the money to hold on to it and will turn it into luxury condos, which will make them several $1 million a year. That's the reality. And Reverend Porkchop wasn't talking about what we should be getting either. He was just attacking cash reparations. That's why CNN had him on. And they didn't even raise the issue themselves. They didn't bring on any of the people from the San Francisco Reparations Task Force who might disagree with him. They didn't bring anyone on who would counter him. If they had done that, at least that would have made the piece newsworthy, because if Reverend Hogmogs with a chitlin juice running down his jaw was going to complain about $5 million being an arbitrary number, then CNN, if they were a real news organization, they would have invited one of those task force members on to explain their reasoning. But they didn't, because this wasn't about news. It wasn't about explaining anything. It was about attacking cash reparations. Everything he said lent itself to that narrative. And that's the white media frame for it, and you can tell because they didn't ask him any tough questions, didn't try to counter him. They did not poke any holes in his reasoning, and there were holes big enough to drive a Mack truck through. They didn't bring up his flip-flopping on letters from last week. They didn't challenge him on anything, because the point was to validate him, or at least make it seem like he had a point. That's how the white media works. When they know that they don't actually have a counter-argument, they bring somebody on so they can let them just filibuster and monologue for them. Keep in mind, Fox News is going on trial right now for exactly this kind of yellow journalism, letting their so-called guests say the things that the network doesn't think they can get away with saying themselves, and then after the Negro bootlick puppet says exactly what they wanted, they have a phony panel who then goes on to agree with everything that the guest said. This is all scripted. Neither Brown nor Camerata said a syllable about land because Brown wasn't brought in to advocate for reparations. He was there to be a blackface saying that reparations is a laughingstock and not to be taken seriously. And what does he advocate for? Nothing. I hammered that point because I know there's going to be some bootlicks and some white supremacist lurkers who are going to try to see if they can claim, well, he was saying cash reparations. No, he wasn't. It would be one thing if he said cash reparations wasn't feasible, but he instead wanted each black person to get 40 acres tax-free for 50 years. At least that would have been advocating for some sort of tangible reparations, but he didn't even do that much. All he did was complain about cash reparations. If you're someone who opposes reparations, which is 70% according to Brown, then you would agree with everything he said. The white guy who worked for the Bush administration who called cash reparations woke, he didn't have one word of criticism for anything Brown said, didn't have anything to criticize Brown about at all, even though Brown said the $5 million was his idea. That's because the white guy understood that Brown was attacking reparations, not just cash, or the amount of the cash reparations. You can't deny that. Now you see how frightening the prospect of cash reparations makes them, and if it's got them this scared, you ought to be asking why. You see that the white media is terrified of it, and they're attacking it. Even if you're one of the gimme some land contingent, you have to agree that tells you cash reparations is the right direction. When someone attacks cash reparations and then claims they're in favor of it, but only after massive public outrage, and then later goes on TV and says $5 million cash reparations is ridiculous, it's a laughingstock, but they then don't tell you what a reasonable cash dollar figure would be, then that person is not in favor of cash reparations. They're not in favor of reparations at all. And if you're supporting someone like that, that means you're not in favor of reparations either. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Wesley Monroe, Sherrod Martin, Rose Arnold, Hollingsworth, and Deborah Gallman. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.